concept 4, we're going to be talking about photosynthesis. So in concept 3, we talked about energy flow through ecosystems. So we were looking at big picture, how does energy get from the sun into different organisms? Because we said the sun is the source of all energy on Earth. Today we're specifically going to talk about photosynthesis, which is a process that producers use in order to capture that energy and store it in sugar that we will later be able to use as consumers. So, overview. Remember, all organisms need a constant supply of energy in order to survive. And for most life on Earth, the ultimate source of energy is the sun. The only life that it wouldn't be the case is those that do chemosynthesis, which we mentioned in energy flow. Now, converting energy from the sun into something that is usable is accomplished by photosynthesis. And we'll talk about why plants are able to do this and we can't in a minute too. So here's kind of the overview. Photosynthesis is the overall process by which sunlight, which is solar energy or light energy, is going to be chemically converted, it's going to chemically convert water and carbon dioxide into chemical energy stored in glucose, which is a sugar or a carbohydrate, which is one of our macromolecules. And it's represented by the following chemical equation. Now, you should be familiar with this because it's a very key biochemical reaction. I showed you this equation in concept 1. We're going to talk more about this on the next page, but I love this picture showing sunlight comes into the plant, CO2 comes in the stomata of the leaves of the plant, and water comes in the roots, and then sugars are created and oxygen is released. So it's kind of a picture of what's going to be going down. All right, let's look at this equation a little bit more. Remember, reactants or substrate are ingredients. Carbon dioxide and water, CO2 and H2O, are reactants in this equation. Products are the results, they're what's being made, and that's glucose, or C6H12O6, and oxygen, or O2. These sixes are important. Those are coefficients. They tell you how many of those molecules are being made. You definitely need to know this equation. You should be able to write it out from memory on your assessments. Now, solar energy over the arrow. What the heck is that? Solar energy from the sun is necessary for photosynthesis to happen, as well as some enzymes that help the process. But it isn't considered an ingredient, meaning a reactant, or a product. So that's why we write it over the arrow. So you can write sun or solar energy over your arrow, but we don't put it on either side. But we do want it over the arrow because it is critical for this process to happen. Now, photosynthesis is going down in the chloroplast, which we learned about in our cells unit, but we need to know more about the chloroplast. So the chloroplast has two main parts, grana and stroma. Grana are these stacks that look like stacks of pancakes, and they're stacks of thylakoid membrane. So each of these individual little pancake things are thylakoid membrane. So there's a grana, an individual pancake is thylakoid membrane. Okay, so think of the pancakes as one part of the chloroplast. Stroma is the fluid-like substance that fills the space between the grana. So that's just the fluid that's in the chloroplast. Okay, so we've got pancakes and we got syrup. Okay, I always remember syrup is the stroma because they both start with S, and then pancakes is the grana or the thylakoid membrane. All right, now there's two stages of photosynthesis. So I'm going to give you really brief overview, and then we'll go through some details of each. One happens in one part of the chloroplast, the other happens in the other part. So it's basically two sets of small reactions. First is the light-dependent reaction. So if it's dependent on light, this is kind of like the photo part because it requires light. We have to have solar energy for this part. It's also known as the electron transport chain. So the ETC is another name for this, or in some textbooks you may even see it just called the light reaction. RXN is just an abbreviation for reaction. So 3 names, not to confuse you at all, but I just want to give you all 3 so that if you do see this somewhere else, you're not confused. The second step is the light independent reaction, so it doesn't need solar energy. This is the synthesis part. This is where we actually synthesize the sugar. And this is also known as the Calvin cycle or the dark reaction because it happens in the without light. You don't need light for it. So those are all the fancy names for that one. All right, so now we're going to go through each one. First, the light dependent reaction. I remember that this comes first because D comes before I in the alphabet. All right, the purpose of this step is to capture energy from the sun, and we're going to store it in energy-carrying molecules, which are ATP and NADPH. So ATP actually shows up here. It's going to help us, along with NADPH, which is a similar type molecule, to kind of power the process. It's going to happen in the grana, so the stack of pancakes. Specifically, it's happening in an individual pancake, so the thylakoid membrane, because that's where chlorophyll is. And chlorophyll is a pigment that plants have that allow them to capture sunlight. You cannot do photosynthesis because you do not have chloroplast with chlorophyll. So that is why you cannot do this process and plants can. Okay? I remember that this happens in the grana because I think when I'm going to make breakfast, I put the pancakes on my plate first and then I put the syrup on second. So I'm going to do the first step where the pancakes are, the grana, the second step with the syrup or the stroma. Alright, so basically the summary is that energy from the sun gets passed down this electron transport chain. And as it's passed down, it gets stored in the bonds of ATP and NADPH. Water also gets split. It gets split into oxygen and hydrogen. And at the end of this, it releases oxygen as a waste product. So oxygen is one of my products. It gets made in this step. It's not really on purpose. It just kind of happens. Then that ATP and NADPH that we charged up in the ETC move on to power the next step. And then the hydrogen, they're technically H pluses that were ripped off the water. Those leave also. And all three of these things go into stroma for the next step. So this whole first step is powered by the sun. But because the second step happens without the sun, we have to have this ATP and NADPH to power it. So the first step is all about just making ATP and NADPH to power the second step. Alright, now this process, I show you this picture because it is so much more complicated than I'm teaching you. And I just want you to appreciate the lack of detail I'm making you understand. I just want you to know the very big picture of what's going on here. Alright, second step is a light independent reaction. The purpose of it is to use the energy from the energy-carrying molecules from the dependent reaction, aka ATP and NADPH, and we're going to make sugar, glucose. So we're storing energy in glucose. This happens in the stroma, or the syrupy part. Remember, second part is in the stroma. Alright, summary. This is the Calvin cycle. A bunch of chemical reactions happen, and they're powered by ATP and NADPH. And basically what they're doing is they're taking hydrogens from water and they're combining them with carbon dioxide, and we're making sugar from it. So we're making that C6H12O6. So we're using CO2 and H's from water and we're making glucose. That's what's happening. Again, this is a really complicated process that I'm not making you know in detail. So I want you to appreciate the fact that you're only learning the very big picture of this. And I understand that it's so much more complicated than you're being taught. Alright, reminder. Chemosynthesis is the process an organism making its own food from chemicals instead of sunlight, which is photosynthesis. So we're not going to go through the details of that. You only need to know photosynthesis, but do know some producers do this process also in order to get their energy. Alright, so all energy pretty much starts in the sun. We need it as ATP. The first kind of step in this transition from sun to ATP is taking it from the sun and storing it in sugar, which is the process of photosynthesis that you just learned about. In Concept 5, we're going to talk about the next step, which is eating foods without sugar in it and then breaking it down to release ATP.